Chapter 2 of Ester Ried's Namesake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ester Ried's Namesake by Pansy. Chapter 2, Sacrifice. He remembered every detail of that eventful evening. The corn had been popped and most of it eaten, and it was nearly time for him to race around the square to his own home, when Alfred was directed to go for his sister Sadie, who was at the library. "Come on, Spencer," he had said. "You may as well go with me, since you have got to go out in the rain anyhow." And then Ester had spoken. "No, Spencer will stay and take care of me, dear, while you are gone. It will be time for my drops before you can get back, and I know he is willing to wait and give them to me." The missionary remembered how his face had flushed with pleasure over the thought that she treated him like a brother, and trusted him for service. Alfred had gone away, whistling cheerily, and he had stayed and counted the drops with exceeding care, and measured just the right amount of water; and as she lay back among the pillows after taking them, she had laid a soft white hand on his arm and said: "Sit down here a minute, Spencer. I like to be where I can look at your strong, young face, and think of what you will do by and by. I want you to do some of my work, my boy. I don't know just how or where; that part doesn't matter. I wanted to go among people who did not know God very well, and help them to get acquainted with Him; really acquainted, I mean, not simply members of the church as I was for years without knowing why, or caring much about it. I believe that the very lonesomest people there are in this world are those who think that they know Jesus Christ, and have only a bowing acquaintance with Him." This had seemed strange talk to the boy who had been reverently trained in his home. It sounded almost improper, he thought, to talk of a bowing acquaintance with Jesus Christ; only, of course, Ester Ried would never do anything that was improper. She had smiled at his wondering look, as she said: "You will never be that sort of Christian, my boy, I am sure of it. I wonder if you would be willing to promise something? No, on second thought I will not ask you to promise. But you may remember that I want you to spend your life in trying to help people to know the Lord Jesus in the true sense." The missionary remembered how his heart beat, and how strangely he felt as he tried to stammer out that he did not know how to help anybody. But she had only smiled again, a wonderfully bright, glad smile, as she said: "You will learn how, my boy. He will teach you. I have His promise that He will direct both you and Alfred. But you will each work in your own way, and I foresee that you can do some things for Christ that Alfred cannot." She had not said a great deal more. The boy went home a few minutes afterward, as she advised him to do, without waiting for Alfred's return; but she had made an impression that lasted. He could seem to feel again the thrills of determination that surged through him as he trudged home in the darkness and rain. He made himself a solemn promise that he would do work in the world which should be worthy of Ester Ried's trust in him. He did not know what kind of work, he made no plans, and had no thought at the time that the resolves of that night would ever lead him to far western regions as a home missionary. He only knew that he meant to hold himself ready for his call. All this he had done. All through the years of boyhood, young manhood, and middle age, Spencer Randall had carried with him the impulse of that last talk with the sister of the boy friend. Not that he had imagined that it would be the last talk. No one, not even Ester Ried herself, had realized that her opportunities were so swiftly reaching their end. But it was not quite a week afterward that Spencer stood beside the casket and read through blinding tears that, big boy though he called himself, he made no attempt to hide, the simple inscription on the plate: "Ester Ried, aged 19." He had named his only child Ester Ried, and never was a child the subject of more earnest prayer and eager hope. Both mother and father had earnestly desired that the ideal Ester Ried whom they had fashioned, the one out of memories, and the other from the vivid impressions of her husband, should be reproduced in their daughter. Yet both were obliged to realize the sharp contrasts between the ideal and the real. "She is a dear girl," would the father say, looking fondly after his Ester as she skipped away, intent on some scheme which for the time being absorbed all her energies. A dear girl, but the words nearly always ended in a sigh. Still, very few of Esther Randall's acquaintances would have understood her father's sigh. The girl was universally admired as well as liked. The little struggling church, situated in a Western town that had disappointed the expectations of its founders in almost every respect, had good reasons for admiring the daughter of the faithful home missionary who served them. That vigorous, energetic daughter, who could not only trim the easily irritated church lamps so that they would not smoke, and would emit a reasonable amount of light, but who could play the wheezy little organ in such a manner as to disguise the defects of the keys that were out of tune, and cover the absence of the keys that wouldn't go. She could also start the tunes in prayer meeting, where they had no organ, and carry the soprano in church, and help the tenor on occasion over hard places. A girl of versatile gifts was Ester Ried Randall. There were those in the church who believed that she could preach, had necessity compelled, and give them as good a sermon as they cared to hear. In short, the church and the village generally believed in the missionary's daughter. It is sad to have to admit that it was in her own home that Esther's deficiencies were most distinctly felt. Not that this is mentioned as something unusual. On the contrary, the fact that the home is the crucial test of character is so well understood that it has become an axiom. Yet the pity of it must always press itself upon our attention, that the place we love the most, and the place where we are the most needed of any spot on earth, should be the scene of our heaviest failures. Poor Ester Ried, who knew nothing of her namesake's early trials and failures, bemoaned in metaphorical sackcloth and ashes her innumerable falls from the pedestal of her resolutions. "Poor father!" she moaned in the solitude of her own room after one of her descents. "To have such an ideal and then such a dismal reality! It is ever so much worse than if he had expected only an ordinary being in the first place. I'm sure I don't know how he can endure the sight of me. If he were not the best father in the whole world, he would hate me, and I shouldn't blame him either." She was very severe upon herself, which was perhaps not strange, since it was only too evident that in the direction where there was most need of improvement the almost daily record was failure. Her thorn in the flesh, or as she had once expressed it, her whole thorn bush, was Aunt Sarah, her mother's oldest sister, who had made her home with them since Esther's early childhood. Poor Aunt Sarah was the manner in which even her sister spoke oftenest of her, and without doubt Aunt Sarah was poor in the truest sense of that word. Her life, even in girlhood, had been such that the word failure seemed the best one to describe it. She had gone early from home to be the spoiled darling of a grandmother who had had spasms of ordering her about with unreasoning and imperious wilfulness, but for the most part had been governed herself by the girl's lightest whim. Before reaching her 18th year the girl had married against the earnest protestations of her parents and the command of her grandmother. A few stormy years of married life, during which she suffered enough at the hands of an intemperate and unprincipled man to subdue some natures, and then he was accidentally killed in a drunken quarrel. The young widow went back to her childhood home as undisciplined by her life of trial as she had been when she went away from it a young girl. It was when her youngest sister had been for 5 or 6 years the wife of a home missionary that financial trouble came to the old home. The father, a wealthy man who had lavished every luxury that money could buy upon his wife and children, was suddenly stricken with disease at a time when conditions in the business world were such that every atom of strength which his knowledge of business and his singularly well-balanced mind could have offered was needed to tide them over a crisis. And he could not even be asked any questions. One great source of comfort to the stricken family lay in the fact that "father" went home, to the house not made with hands, without ever having heard of financial troubles. They were heavy enough. Everybody who knew him was ready to affirm that had Mr. Bradford lived, he could have undoubtedly tided them through the breakers. But he did not live, and the storm swept everything available. Out of the wreck were secured only a few hundreds, barely enough to keep the widow and her one unmarried daughter from want until they could look about them and contrive some way of earning a living. And the blow fell heavily also on home mission ground. Mr. Bradford had delighted in making a bower of beauty of that little western cottage where his youngest darling lived. To the plain people by whom it was surrounded, its furnishings seemed wildly extravagant, and they stood in awe before its choice pictures and its wealth of books. Mr. Bradford had smiled to himself over the talk he had with the earnest young missionary who came to ask him for his daughter. The young man had struggled to be very plain spoken, so that the rich man might understand fully the life of privation and toil that he had been bold enough to ask his daughter to share. There must be no feeling afterward that the father had been deceived in the conditions. "It is a growing town," said Mr. Randall, "bound to grow, I think. The railroad which is now partially built and is being surveyed directly through the village will connect us with the great markets, and there is no better point at which to build up a city than just that one. Property is a third higher this fall all about there than it was in the spring, and is steadily on the increase. So I think we may safely predict that in less than 2 years the church which I am to serve will become self-supporting. But," and here the earnest face had flushed a little, and for an instant he dropped his eyes, then raised them again and spoke firmly, "I think I ought to tell you, sir, that Helen and I have talked all this over and understand each other. We do not want to boom with the town. We have cast in our lot as home missionaries. At least I mean," and his face grew redder, "that such is my intention, and Helen is in sympathy with it. We want to be pioneers in every sense of the word. It is our desire, as soon as a church that we are serving becomes self-supporting, to move on to a harder field and struggle up with the people to the self-supporting stage. This is different in some respects from what many home missionaries plan, but it seems to me to be what has been given me to do, and I have consecrated my life to just such service. At first I had no thought, no hope I may say, of finding a wife who would sacrifice herself in that way, and I meant to, but your daughter, sir," and then Mr. Randall felt rather than saw the twinkle in the prosperous business man's eyes, and stopped and laughed. Mr. Bradford was a good as well as a rich man. He had gone down into the depths of pain over the marriage of his oldest daughter, but he believed in the young man who had sought the heart of his youngest. Also, he believed in missions. "So you have made up your mind to sacrifice yourself," he said cheerfully, "and my Helen has persuaded you that such is also her state of mind, has she? I am not surprised. The child has been sacrificing herself to something or somebody ever since she could walk, and she has high ideals. She will meet you more than halfway every time. But I believe in your ideals and in your theories, so far as I understand them. I shall offer no obstacles large enough to hinder the kind of sacrifice which you propose." He spoke that word "sacrifice" with an easy smile. He had no doubt but that they would contrive to make some sacrifices. To bury themselves in their youth and strength in that growing West would be a sort of sacrifice to people of cultured tastes. But such trials as money could avert, he himself would take care should never touch his darling's life. He had been for years an exceedingly liberal giver to home missions. When the home missionaries were his youngest darling and the husband of her choice, what would he not do for them? He had been true to his intentions during those first years. In almost every letter that the prosperous business man found time to write to his daughter, a generous check made up for the brevity of the epistle, and the home missionary and his wife, in addition to their regular work in the parish, had had the rare privilege of scattering material comforts with lavish hand in the homes of the poor and sick. When suddenly, out of a clear sky, the bolt of sorrow and misfortune fell, there were many who could honestly mourn with the missionaries. They, too, had lost a friend, who, although he had perhaps never heard their names, had contributed steadily to their needs. It was when their bereavement and almost bewilderment over the changed state of things was fresh upon them, that Helen Randall thought of and planned another quiet sacrifice. It was days before she mentioned it to her husband, not, indeed, until she had the entire plan mentally arranged, down to the minute particulars, ready for his approval or disapproval. Then she introduced it quietly enough. They were lingering at the breakfast table, their little girl Ester having been excused to run out and play. "Spencer," said Mrs. Randall, as she gave him a plump peach she had pared for him, "do you think there is any way in which we could manage it to have Sarah come out to us for a long visit?" She could have cried over his look of utter astonishment, but instead she laughed. Men were so stupid. CHAPTER III.